Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothkushel.
Ah, man, another. So obviously we got to talk about the big story, and I think this is something that we've been discussing the possibility of the of events like what's happened in the last week taking place. I think for quite a while. And first of all, we had this series of pipe bomb threats that were sent to a number of obviously leading, I guess, liberal deep state type of operatives such as former presidents and of course George Soros and Eric Holder, people of that nature, Obama, the Clintons, and then of
And
course
don't
it
forget
all.
Maxine Waters, evil
Oh,
Maxine. The woman. Do you remember that Maxine Waters was the woman who actually, although she, since that time, I think she's been stood down, but she at one point was one of the people in Congress looking into the cocaine trafficking into American cities in relationship to the CIA shenanigans in the 80s.
very true, yeah, and so very true for sure, and yeah, she's one of their certainly. I get certainly she was also or implicated in all as a receiver of threats, and then of course there were a few others, and then it got. I'm glad you threw that in there because people seem to forget that when they talk about like and all the dog whistling of Maxine's low IQ and all that. So glad you brought that up. And then the big one on Saturday we had. I'm not even going to begin to speculate about what actually may or may not have taken place at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, but we we know that just based on what we know about what we've seen and the way the narrative is being spun on this is being put together on this event, and everybody is following a script as always in the aftermath of an event like this. You can blame one side or the other. You can blame Trump or you can blame the liberals or whatnot, but the same script is pretty much, I think, being followed. There is a very, I want to say, very carefully put together script that always seems to be followed after these kind of events, and you're seeing that happen here too. But for us, Jeremy, it's frustrating in a way. I don't want to toot our own horn here, but I think we've been events like this with these threats and this event at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, and just the increased ramping up of rhetoric that leads to these type of events, or at the very least, the ability to really, in the eyes of the public, make events like this plausible in the way that they're presented. This is something I think we've been warning about for quite a while, and so I don't. You want to follow up on that here because in a few minutes, I think we're going to get into just the role, perhaps, of an organization like the Anti-Defamation League in shaping so much of this narrative and everything from just promoting and boosting, in a lot of ways, in my opinion, basically boosting the outlets and the organizations and the individuals who are always looked at as those who are putting out exactly the kind of rhetoric that basically creates the circumstances, creates the environment for a successful media narrative in the aftermath of type of events which took place in the last week. And then also in the case of Jonathan Greenblatt, the robotic head of the Anti-Defamation League, comes out and offers us the solution. So I do want to get into that. I don't know if you had any initial, I think we can get into that in a minute, and maybe you can give your take on that, but do you have any initial thoughts? Obviously, you being of a Jewish background yourself, you have a very unique perspective on all of this.
Well, maybe delving into this Pittsburgh incident and then moving back out from it. And I think it's alleged to be 9 people murdered by a single individual at the Temple of Life synagogue in this Squirrel Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh, in the middle of a bris circumcision naming ceremony. And what's been reported is that all of the 9 individuals who are reported to be killed are elders, over 50, and people are talking about how this is the worst single attack on Jewish people as specific targets in American history, and that is a horrific thing, and it feels horrible to be targeted and collectivized in relationship to your whatever your group is. And at the same time, we should recognize that if this incident and of these reported killings is the worst single incident of targeting Jewish people for death in the United States of America over 200 years of history, then in many ways there's a lot of grace in relationship to the Jewish security in the United States of America. And I think that should be recognized, especially in the wake of people, understandably, of all different backgrounds, but most intensely maybe of Jewish background, of decrying this and of speaking out against what they see as the kind of intellectual, political environments that help potentially create this kind of situation. But meanwhile, over the weekend, or maybe before the weekend, it didn't really get reported along with this, 3 Semitic Palestinian children were killed by the Jewish state. They had a long life ahead of them. And so at the same time as Jewish suffering is being put front and center, Jewish privilege and the way it's been weaponized to disappear the as equal lives that are lost by people whose names we don't know, maybe we'll never know them. They're just sort of over there. They're not really even, and they're not even Semitic. They're not even, their language that could describe them has been occupied by this other group of people. So I'm of a lot of mixed feelings about this moment, and at the same time, you could also see September 11th if you think about a single day in U.S. history where not only the most Americans were specifically targeted for murder, but the most Jews also targeted for murder, hundreds, I believe, on September 11th, and then knowing the facts that point in strongly in the direction of high-level elements in the Jewish state so-called security apparatus as having desired this massacre and in many ways architected over long periods of time, if not decades. And you, as a Jew, and as a Jew in America, and as a Jewish American, I've tried to have my perspective correct here in relationship to what it means to want security for oneself, for one's family, but then to want security for every human being. And that Jewish people in the United States of America are going to have to wake up quickly in relationship to what is actually going on here and where the nature of the real threats here. And it is horrific for 9 people to be murdered. Basically, not for any individual thing that they are alleged to have done or any kind of response in that kind of way, but just for, where they were, what they were doing, who they are, the identity of their religion or ethnicity. But meanwhile, we are seeing the murder of Semitic people, Palestinian people, and more largely Arab and Muslim people in relationship to this September 11th attack that took more Jewish lives. Let's just put it in this sort of, myopic Jewish perspective. More Jewish lives combined than all the other attacks on Jewish individuals in America combined, I would bet. And then that's used then to justify and reinforce these illegitimate power networks that include the Jewish state power networks that are used to then destroy the lives of numerous people in Palestine and around the world. So I think we need to get our perspective right in this moment and not be suckered in by the usual appeals to the canary in the coal mine and anti-Semitism as is just some type of organic, unexplainable, preternatural instinct that we can't really explain, and that the Jews, the so-called Jew, is going to be hated forever, and we just have to keep it tamped down. And then anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine for all types of oppressed people, and that it's as simple as that. And then you have basically the setup of ADL Jonathan Greenblatt to be able to be perfectly placed to go on television and do his rendition of "Shut It Down." He really said that. He said that. He went on television and was talking. What's he talking about? The internet? Hateful discourse? How's this? What's actually going on here?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Thank you for sharing thoughts on that and bringing that perspective to it, because it is so true how. And I'll say this also about the Jewish nature of this event at a synagogue. For me, like, for all the talk you hear of Jewish power and all the sympathy that, like, all the attempts to play up and shore up hysteria about anti-Semitism and anti-Jewishness, to me, this is the time when, like, as far as I've ever seen, where blatantly and overtly, like, Jewish anti-Jewishness, anti-Semitism is front and center in every single media narrative that you see coming out of this. It's like, this is where, like, we're particularly, I'm not even talking about from a historical perspective, like going back to World War II, or, the Shoah during World War II, the Holocaust. They're not even talking about that. I'm talking about just current events. Like, this is the first time I've ever seen, like, actual, like, anti-Semitism and anti-Jewishness taking front and center and just the entire media and cultural political narrative in a way that I've never seen it happen before. So I think that is uniquely interesting. It's also interesting considering the timing, and of course with the last couple of years of the Trump administration, and even obviously all of what I think that we've tried to analyze in the past, the very real dog whistling at the very least by Donald Trump and also people around him, perhaps some of the types of data mining, psychological, you might call them psychological warfare operations that were creating narratives for Trump to use, creating talking points for the Trump campaign and now administration to use. Obviously, there is at the very least dog whistling, and at the very worst, obvious, not even subtle, reaching out in a lot of cases to like these right-wing conservative nationalistic types. Some have overt anti-Jewish mindsets and beliefs, and some don't. But you see this, at the very least, there is this dog whistling going on there. And over the last couple of years, you've even got to where, like, the discussion has been to use the term globalist, which of course is someone like Alex Jones's go-to, or in discussing someone like George Soros, who really is a perfect Jewish boogeyman to point at as the proof of of exactly this kind of narrative that is playing out, and I think is really being manufactured and contrived at very high levels even you get the talk that he's using the term globalist anti-Semitic. So clearly we've had a lot of this dog whistling at the very least dog whistling, at the very worst just overt reaching out and playing to a very anti-Jewish set in our population. And you did mention the Anti-Defamation League and Jonathan Greenblatt. Of course, I think we've done a couple. I think we did some very important programs that we did on the history of the Anti-Defamation League and its kind of its Judeo-Masonic background and the B'nai B'rith and the creation, and over the years, just some of the many examples of how the Anti-Defamation League has set up so many different organizations, from the Anti-Defamation League to the NAACP to even something like the Ku Klux Klan, historically have roots within this Masonic B'nai B'rith. And we did those shows, and obviously we capitalized off of the work of people within the Lyndon LaRouche organization, as well as the late William Cooper. I would recommend perhaps some of those shows for a bigger, I think, from our perspective, more historical basis for this. But certainly in the rise up and coming of the age of Donald Trump, you've had the Anti-Defamation League front and center, playing a key role in all this, which we identified after the Jewish Community Center bomb threats, which took place not long after Trump was inaugurated. And you have, what I see here is just this another example, I think, of something that the Anti-Defamation League has been involved with for a long time. And that is both the, I think, shaping of narratives in terms of setting up specific types of basically publicizing and setting up certain media outlets or individuals or figures, particularly on the right side. Of course, there's also, you also have your Louis Farrakhan's out there, and you even have the hard left, quote unquote, critics of Israel that are often referred to as anti-Semites or whatnot. But particularly in this case, since it's dealing with this synagogue event and the obvious far right nature of the alleged synagogue shooter, you have this Anti-Defamation League propping up and promoting the outlets such as the Daily Stormer, which of course now the primary source for people like Andrew Anglin online, now that they have had their Twitter privileges revoked, is this Gab website where this alleged shooter posted all of these memes and posts and article about Donald Trump being controlled by the Jew. I believe he said that basically Donald Trump is dominated by kikes. That's his words. He's ruled, they own him and he's doing their bidding and all this. And so I remember we pointed out, the Anti-Defamation League about a year or so ago put out a pamphlet basically breaking down into two categories. One is the alt-right and the other is the alt-light. And I think this was largely contrived as a means to basically set up a narrative where you have where you try to create a real significant difference between these entities, between this network of operatives on the far right side of our political and social spectrum, who basically work together in so many ways, I think, to get Donald Trump elected. If you want to go back, for example, look at the cross correspondence between people like Milo Yiannopoulos and Richard Spencer, or even Milo citing, I believe, the Daily Stormer, I believe he did, in his Breitbart manifesto on the guide to the alt-right that was written, I think, in the spring of 2016. But I think this ADL, I don't know if you want to call it whether it was some type of, it was a press release or if it was a dossier or whatever term you want to use for this, breaking down the alt-right, which are the overt anti-Jewish activists on the right. And then you've got the alt-light, those who are not anti-Jewish but are very much pushing a lot of the more, you might call, extreme talking points that are prevalent within the right spectrum, such as anti-immigrant talking points and some of the more extreme anti-liberal talking points, maybe anti-globalist talking points. But in this, you see all of the names of the people that are really pushing the more, I think, a more extreme, hardcore type of rhetoric that is exemplified in people such as this alleged synagogue shooter here. And that, of course, would be the Daily Stormers, Andrew Anglin, and all these names of these people that are prevalent throughout this list of names that the Anti-Defamation League put out about a year ago. And of course, so much of the media, I think, takes its lead from ADL and also Southern Poverty Law Center for sure, what is put out by these organizations, and use that as the basis for the whatever talking point or narrative is being put out about extremism and hate in our society. So you see that, and obviously it is different from the realm of the Daily Stormer, that Daily Stormer is very overtly pro-Trump and portrays Trump as the brave president who's fighting the brave leader who's fighting back against basically what they see as the Jewish takeover of our society, whereas this alleged synagogue shooter was actually pushing that Trump is a tool of the Jews, but he's also even putting out there the narrative that Trump is was co-opted or whatever, that he was originally opposing so many things that he's now supporting. And of course, it was the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, I believe, that really, if you believe the official narrative, is what really caused him to really go out and take action and want to kill all Jews, as he's alleged to have said after this event took place. So
it is interesting. It is interesting that the rhetoric, that's the sort of the quote that they said he said both inside and then after he was arrested, I believe, or all Jews must die, kill all Jews. And that is exactly the exact rhetoric, word by word, that was apparently put on Professor Tony Hall's Facebook page.
Yes.
By one Joshua Goldberg, who published at may I say this, Meyer Amschel Anglin. Is that an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that I just put out there? His website, the Daily Stormer, Joshua Goldberg posted for months on end as Michael Slay, the uber neo-Nazi, with very similar kind of rhetoric. And so this kind of rhetoric was pasted. I've already seen this kind of weaponized rhetoric being used as a weapon against, against an academic of conscience, an activist of conscience who clearly stands for the rights of indigenous peoples, but all peoples all around the world, and with a very a pretty careful approach and intellectual approach to uncovering the truth as he sees it. And so that was just plugged onto his page, and then that ultimately was the opening shot in a process that ultimately drives him out of the academy. So isn't that interesting? And I think you're completely right, Greg, about breaking this up into this idea of that ADL dossier. And I'd forgotten about that. And you have the sort of the alt-light and then the alt-right lists. And I was thinking that the bookends of these mass, sort of terror events of some sort this week, in terms of the so-called MAGA bomber and this alleged synagogue shooter, that they perfectly line up with those two sort of boxes of identified thought in many ways. And this alleged MAGA bomber with all the stickers, and it's really about the evil demon rats and and Trump is a god, and Trump on the tank, and it's
CNN
just
is fake news.
Yes, exactly. And and in the background, there's some major questions there about not only the nature of how this was done, whether there were more people involved, his connections. He has apparently sort of strong connections with mob ties, both Italian and I believe Israeli potentially.
This may not mean anything, but even the name, I believe Steve Pieczenik was talking about his name, which is a combination of Caesar, and you know what that entails, as well as, I believe, Seok, which is could be even construed as a reference to chaos. There's even that too. It's like, I don't know why I even brought that up, but there's even that also. So
yes, and then the alleged synagogue shooter with the gab and the all Jews must die. And he's sort of a disgruntled. He had hopes for Trump, the great white man who was going to save the country from the evil Jews, and the spawn of Satan, and so all of those talking points. And then of course it's then targeted at some unidentified temple of worshipers for some identified reason.
It is interesting that. I didn't mean to cut you off there, but it is interesting that this, even like in the case of someone who might slightly deviate from the standard type of Daily Stormer alt-right type of rhetoric, which is probably, I'm sure, is prominent on Gab, which I'm not a regular visitor of. I've seen enough of like the Andrew Anglin style post on that website, as well as on the Daily Stormer itself, to know kind of the narratives and the memes they push, which they claim are trolling when they're jokingly calling for people to throw Jews back in the gas chambers and all this. And so but it is interesting that even in the context of someone who's a critic of Trump, even from a perspective, if we're to believe this whole official narrative, and I think there's obviously a lot of reasons not not to, but that's not where I don't think that's where we particularly want to go with this conversation. I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are playing the role of Monday morning quarterback and analyzing all of that stuff for better, for worse, as well as far as what may or may not have actually happened at this synagogue. But it's funny how someone who rises along is even a critic of Trump from like an anti-Jewish perspective. It's not the fact that Trump is basically a bought and paid for agent of the mouthpiece creation of this global, largely Jewish, largely Russian mafia, which operates globally and has obviously huge inroads in Russia and also in Israel, as well as in the United States, particularly in New York City, where Donald Trump really made his rise to fame and power. And as Craig Unger in his book that we've seen so many has broken down basically the very first Trump from the moment he really became a name as far as the Trump Tower. From the moment that was established, it was a place, it was a haven for these Russian Jewish mob figures to come in and basically launder money and clean their money or whatnot. And so we could argue whether or not Donald Trump knew about that or not. But it is interesting that even in the narrative of the anti-Jewish or the critic of Trump from a perspective that he's too friendly to the Jews, coming from, say, from a far right-wing persona, that it's not this kind of stuff. It's not these obvious facts that anybody can go out there and find about Donald Trump's background, the fact that he really is a made man and agent and creation of this global mafia-style entity that basically spawned him in so many ways. No, it's that Trump is being too much of a cuck, basically, because he's giving these Jews the power to continue throwing brown people into our society. So I find that interesting. Even from that perspective, it's just this same old contrived divide and conquer nonsense, in my opinion, at the end of the day, that really just continues to just split our society apart, rather than actually any kind of real hard actual type of research or information regarding who Donald Trump is and what he actually appears to represent.
Yeah, the idea of hard-nosed factual analysis, power critical analysis that actually deals with like names and dates and structures and events and stuff like that, rather than just talking points that are easy to repeat. And it is interesting. I just want one last thing in terms of an analysis of what the sort of endpoint incidents of this week of the alt-light and the alt-right, apparently perfectly represented to the country in many ways. And yes, I think it can be analyzed in both of these cases, that there are some questions that need to be asked and investigations needing to be done about the alleged perpetrators. And I already pointed out some of the stuff around the alleged MAGA bomber, but in terms of the alleged synagogue shooter, there's the question of the time and the place around this, and that it turns out that it looks like that of all of the Jewish community centers, and the way that this sort of works is that the Jewish community centers are sort of federalized a little bit. I mean, what I mean by that, or federated, I would say, and that they have an umbrella organization of North America, I believe. That's probably what holds it all together. But then in every sort of major region, sort of population dense region of Jewish communities in the entire North America, they have these individual federations that are sort of the overarching institutional umbrella. And of all of the U.S. Jewish community sort of centers that are aligned with these Jewish federations, it was one of only two in the entire country was this Pittsburgh area one that did a drill, an active shooter drill in that area earlier in the year, I believe in January, along with the FBI. And it was the same month, I guess, that this alleged shooter started his account on Gab. So who knows what all of that means? And then the other possibility is that when these things happened, I got the sense that I could also very much see the explanation of this idea of an organic but a synthetically created organic incidents that might be described in this terminology of stochastic terrorism, which is the idea of utilizing mass media, psychological warfare, communications networks in very specific and weaponized and targeted ways to specifically collectivize certain groups of people, and that you can then in statistically significant fashions then basically create terrorism towards that group of people. Basically, statistically consistent with, you know, that it's going to happen if you do these types of things. So I can see that and maybe that's an indicator that I should be suspicious about, that these two, the MAGA bomber and the synagogue shooter, are sort of too perfect in certain ways in terms of the way that they line up with everything you would imagine whoever would do these incidents in some type of lone wolf fashion, what they would turn out to be. But sometimes the simplest explanation is correct. I just don't know yet.
And what are they influenced by more than anything? The internet. Which, as you pointed out,
down.
Greenblatt wants to shut down, and he's not the only one.
And is a Greenblatt ultimately just sort of this sort of master troller of some sort, where he's, I mean, why would you? You know that's the sort of alt-right gab, perfect GIF, scenario is Jonathan Greenblatt put on the sort of the curly pace and the hat and the beard and have him say, "Shut it down." So you got to know that he knows. It makes me wonder about whether he's just sort of, master troll in control.
Well, I think that I don't want to get any defamation lawsuits for making any false claims or false statements here, but I have a pretty strong feeling, at the very least, that a lot of these alt-right, certainly Andrew or Meyer, Amschel, Anglin types, are probably at the end of the day on the payroll of the Anti-Defamation League or a similar organization, or at the very least they work together at some level for sure. I mean, I think there's enough out there as far as historical examples of the ADL. I think just manufacturing and playing a direct role in the creation of and perpetuation of these talking points on so much of what passes for the extreme right, that I think I can feel pretty confident in making a statement like that. But you're right, even in the aftermath of this, he's coming out with the perfect statements to play and to throw out there for your, I guess, something they specialize in very, very well, we've talked about before, which is the idea and the concept of mimetic warfare. So,
and I do want to point out too, is that in the midst of this, where you're going to have the ADL and the Jonathan Greenblatts basically attempting to shift this into this idea of what's really dangerous here is what we might title anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And I just want to point out, as I reminded us in the beginning, that the horror and the awful tragedy of nine people's family members grieving of their alleged murder. In the history of the United States of America, Jewish people have been very, very safe. It makes a lot of sense to call the United States the real homeland, ultimately, in the 21st century, of where the Jewish people, ended up in significant numbers and felt very, very secure and very comfortable. Okay, that doesn't deal with the whole shadow side of what all of that also means in relationship to power networks and domination and subterfuge and relationships to Jewish state power networks and all that. But just putting that aside in terms of this sort of this mass understanding of this incident as the worst, tragedy to befall the Jewish people collectively in American history. It's important to remember that as the Jonathan Greenblatts start to bring up the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, the canard, the same way that they, in the wake of the bulk of these threats against Jewish community centers in the United States of America, that Netanyahu seemed to have a weird, strange glint in his eye. Almost seemed similar to the way that Dennis Ross smirked when I was getting jacked up by Homeland Security associated Israeli trained so-called security forces for asking about things like terrorism by Zionists that included the death of Jews. And it's sort of very, very similar in a certain way. The glint that Netanyahu had in his eye, the smirk that he had in relationship to the terrorism against the Jewish community centers in the United States of America, that turned out to be the bulk of it from southern Israel in some type of operation that I believe we still don't know the depth of it, whether it was an intelligence operation of some sort. It has the hallmarks of that. And I agree with you. People should go back maybe and look at some of the shows where we talked about that. I remember something about the JCC bomb hoaxes and the paranoia matrix from early on when we first started posting on YouTube. I think that one deals with this in a interesting fashion that people might want to go look at. But I just want to point out that in the midst of this, when this kind of terrain of doing analysis that can be easily just tagged with anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, weaponized rhetoric by the Jonathan Greenblatts on the television, that it's become even more booby-trapped. This is one of the most difficult intellectual, political, moral terrains to deal with in terms of the issues of Jewish power, of Jewish privilege, of Jewish state crimes against, not only against Palestinians, but against humanity in many ways. And to then sort of lay on top of it these sort of stochastic violent events makes this increasingly difficult to deal with it. And at the same time, let's remind people that those that which is considered the worst of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, such as that which, comes from like Louis Farrakhan or something like that, or people who talk about the protocols for the learned elders of Zion, right? We talked about, I believe it was in our sort of extended show after the Charlottesville incident, that we talked about this film, Defamation, made by an Israeli filmmaker, and he talks to young black men in Brooklyn, I believe, with Orthodox Jewish people walking by, always, living in tight quarters with the most Orthodox Jewish communities in the United States of America, the most obvious, visually Jewish people in the entire country, and talking very calmly with like a very obviously Jewish Israeli, sort of maybe more secular videographer, documentarian about the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, and although there were tiny in the long history of Jewish and black relations in Brooklyn, there have been some, certain flare-ups of tensions, but there's never been any kind of, mass massacre of any sort like this in relationship to these so-called anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that are believed by young black men, just saying, well, look at what it says, the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, or of Farrakhan, putting aside all the questions that we have around that operation in relationship to controlled opposition and all of that, but just looking at, okay, if you think that that's sort of like the source of organized violence against Jews is people who believe or are looking into things like documents and analyzing documents, analyzing power networks, analyzing whether groups of powerful people get together and organize plans in private, i.e., conspiracy, and you look at that, and that has not caused the mass murder of Jews by those identifiable groups, young black men in Brooklyn who are willing to talk about the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, or the Nation of Islam who listens to Louis Farrakhan talk about all kinds of things, including things like the Synagogue of Satan or Israel 9/11, the worst kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And still we live in a very secure United States of America.
Yeah, great point. And on that regard, it is not. In most cases, it's not. What it is actually, I could look at these type of, even the culprits that are being raised in the mainstream media, because here's the thing, like, for example, you'll never hear a narrative of a guy, you'll never, I don't think, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think you'll ever hear a narrative of someone who's going out saying that, that basically dual citizen Israelis, along with traitors in the American government, pulled off or were primarily responsible for September 11th. No, instead, what you have, I think, is these actual, perhaps in some ways, very real conspiracies. Like, for example, you could make an argument, and I think that there's a lot of credence to this, that there is a disproportionate, particularly you might say a more liberal Jewish influence in terms of refugee causes, pro-refugee causes, pro-migration causes into the West. But instead of like actually trying to get any type of serious conversation about the background of these things or actual perhaps possible areas and centers of power where these type of movements originate from, instead of that, no, we're going to just throw out there just all this rhetoric about how the eternal Jews just letting the brown people in to invade us and kill us and destroy our country. So that's where you see it. Whereas it's not an actual any type of real analysis of power structures. Rather, it's playing off of there's an understanding that there's something going on, but ultimately weaponizing conversation about actual areas and how actual power structures. But you're right, in general, it's not people that are, for example, how many people are there actually out there, as you said, that are actually, if that's the case, we should be having a whole lot of, I'll just throw names out there. There should be a whole, I won't throw any names out there in particular, but there should be a whole lot of people who have thinking like us who are just out there just randomly assaulting and killing people. And that's not the case, because ultimately I would say that, and I believe that wholeheartedly, and I think you're right, and it's more or less just the weaponization of these narratives and rather than any type of real conversation of how power works. And so that's going to get me to my last point here, and that is,
Greg, hold on to your last point. I just really I'm very happy you brought up the weaponization of the issues around things like immigrants, migrants, that whole thing very quickly. And I do think it's very telling that that's sort of one of the common talking points or common apparent linkages between these two alleged perpetrators is that it was this migrant invasion that really set them off in many ways. And so just two things to note. One thing is to just sort of like look at this whole thing about building the wall and Trump's going to send down the military to confront these invaders. And meanwhile, the border is already highly militarized, including by Israeli contractor or organizations such as Elbit, communications towers, Magad, I think was one of the other ones. But it's intensely already weaponized. There's drones, there's militarized drones on the border. It's already the only thing that's missing to make it look like it's the border at Gaza is basically just a longer chain linked fence of some sort. But so that's already the case. So this entire thing about the migrants invading, apparently more than 7,000 migrants have already died or been killed in terms of these border regions. So there's already a massacre there in relationship to a militarized border, and then and I think that actually included the second point that I was thinking in relationship to the weaponization of this issue of the second point was that if you track it back, it does look, I saw this, and who knows if this is exactly true, but we should look into it, that the idea of the caravan, the nomenclature of the caravan looks like it sort of popped into the social media sphere, pushed by Russian media, RT and Sputnik. Now we see this transformation into invader. To me, that sounds like hardcore Zionist Israeli propaganda nomenclature that's amplifying it up. It's the same type of thing where they were from, during the assault on Iraq. It was this idea that you had George W. Bush saying this is not the new Crusades. This is just about trying to protect our national security and potentially export democracy. But meanwhile, there was lots of dog whistling from the same groups to his reactionary right in terms of the clash of civilizationers, the hardcore Likudniks and the Zionists who like to use that language to sort of trigger positively aspects of the Christian Zionists. That this was we had to go fight the Muslim invaders over there so that we didn't have to fight them here. So I think it's pretty interesting that becomes like the epicenter informationally about this entire terrain of discussion.
That's an excellent point, and I think we've pointed this out before, but it's very interesting how whether you claim to love Jews like so many of those on the alt-right would, particularly the love Israel, or you claim to absolutely hate and despise Jews and everything they stand for, which is what the alt-right would be, they all push, really at the end of the day, they push, and it's a great point between this so-called MAGA bomber and this synagogue event, that it is the same narratives being pushed at the end of the day. They have, the same enemies. They're both fighting against the brown invader, whether it's of the Islamic variety or whether it's of the Central and South American variety. So that's very very glad you brought that up.
And isn't that collectivized love and hate very much co-located very often in the same exact people, such as Steve Bannon, who's the biggest supporter of the Jewish state and the Jewish power networks, and yet he allegedly privately despises like Jews, especially liberal Jews, or Semyon Mogilevich, the kingpin basically of the Russian Jewish mob, heavy influence, heavy direction in relationship to the Jewish state. He makes his living basically fleecing Jews, and then goes to Israel, and it's too Jewy for him. There's too much actually dialogue and talking for him. So these things are all co-located in many ways. These contradictions.
Or even Roy Cohn, who was said to despise Jews, and I think it was more or less more or less liberal-minded Jews, but yet he himself was obviously, as from like the stereotype of the Jew, as a way like people like the alt-right types want to portray it. Roy Cohn was as Jewish could be, yet he was said to despise Jewish people, despite being Jewish himself, and so it is very interesting. It's this convergence and kind of coming together where Roy Cohn can both be the, hardcore Zionist, but he can also be right there in the borderline in some cases even the more hardcore, just nationalistic, patriotic organizations like the John Birch Society, which at times definitely do veer or put their foot in the water of just some of the more anti-Jewish type of rhetoric that's out there without actually dipping all the way in. So that's another very very accurate, I would say.
And Greg, before you take us out into our last 10 minutes here, I just want to point out that this problem of collectivization, the right is always talking about against the collectivists. That was the whole thing, and in certain ways, this is a lot of the problem. This sort of the collectivizing of guilt, or the collectivizing of certain qualities and painting it onto entire groups of people. And remember what the fascist symbol really is, right? It's the fasces, the collectivized sticks. It is the idea of the collectivizing of a group of people through artificial means in many ways. And so as we see the rise also in Brazil of this recently elected, looks like some type of neo or proto-fascist kind of element, and Alex Jones celebrating it as basically this is just the rise of anti-globalism. The red tide rises worldwide. So I guess fascism is the new globalism because it's international. It's the same transnational fascism, but it is resurgent in many ways. And so there's nothing nationalist about it, nationalistic. It's the same old global fascism.
Yeah, and I'm glad. And Bolsonaro, I don't know too much about him. I mean, what little I know about him, I need to look more into him. But he's definitely part of this shift of power globally, with the far right rising to power and all globally. And so it is interesting. You mentioned Alex Jones praising him, but you also have David Duke, a classic B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation League boogeyman, who is controlled opposition boogeyman, who's praised Bolsonaro is basically fighting for the for native white Brazilians against those who want to destroy Brazil. So there's another example of how these how these interests of the alleged varying interests of these people really come together.
I didn't know that about David Duke, Greg. And so and that's so interesting too, that Bolsonaro is like, his whole like foreign policy is, we do what U.S. and Israel does. And so David Duke once again somehow seems to be on the side in terms of the substantial geopolitics of the Zionist power configuration.
Just like Viktor Orban of Hungary, who they portray as the great hero against migration, but yet his immigration, Hungary's immigration, and all the talking points from immigration all the way to George Soros is just directly in line with the Israeli government. So yeah, once again, you see where this all coincides and comes together. I guess with about a little less than 10 minutes left, I wanted to close out by talking about our idea and understanding of anti-Semitism as it's understood within not just the right side, but also even the left side. And because, for example, when you talk about issues related specifically to Israel and Palestine and defense of the Palestinians against obviously the crimes of the Israeli government against Palestinians, you'll run into, obviously that's very much a left progressive type of movement, obviously. And that means that ultimately when you run into any type of real serious, I would say scholarly, serious, hard research into the actual, what appears to be the actual how power works in terms of historically, and not just knee-jerk talks about Jews and Jews do this, Jews do that, but actual serious research, actual serious evidence, and actually bringing forth serious all types of serious information about historically how power structures work, and even just the actual conversation about the disproportionality of Jewish influence in society that actually comes at it from a serious perspective that is not hateful in any way, shape, or form, that really is just putting out factual information. And I would look at someone like Alison Weir as being an example of where the progressive, primarily largely Jewish elements within the pro-Palestinian movement came down on her real hard, because they said she was being anti-Semitic and while all she was really doing was putting out critical historical analysis of elements of Jewish power working to hand in hand, even the United States prior to the First World War, to help bring about these circumstances which would lead to the rise of the State of Israel. So I also think that a lot of progressive pro-Palestinian voices have played a major role, I think, in, at the very least, enabling the current environment to come about by never allowing an honest conversation of anti-Semitism and the actual real how Jewish power really works and how it doesn't. And instead of trying to actually be honest and point out that people like Alison Weir are not promoting hatred of Jews, but are actually, I mean, Alison Weir hates Jews so much she supported Bernie Sanders for president. I mean, come on. But these are not actual serious conversations about Jewish power and how these power structures work. No, it's just knee-jerk, blind. It's just hatred of Jews. And so I think that in the process of this, I think there's a day of reckoning in a lot of ways for a lot of progressive-minded people who either have knowingly falsely promoted narratives that people who have put out any type of serious discussion of anti-Semitism and Jewish power and Zionism are just hateful people. I think that this has also contributed to this current environment, the inability to be honest about actual research and historical study into how power structures actually work, and even how Jewish power structures work and how they don't work.
Yes, I think this is really, really important, because there's going to be a lot of inertia and momentum in the wake of all of this to shut it down, as Jonathan Greenblatt said. And that's going to mean that there's going to be a focus on core political speech, which includes things like critiques of these power networks, and most blatantly in relationship to Jewish state power networks. And so the boycott, divestment, sanction movement has been in the crosshairs of these groups like the ADL for a long time. That's only going to get amplified. And less than 10 years ago, there was the new definition of anti-Semitism was actually recognized officially by the State Department. And there are certain things in there that make it seem like it's going to become definitionally anti-Semitic to just really discuss things that are blatant and out in the open. For example, from the State Department website, things like accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. And so it doesn't even say the Jews as a whole or a monolithic Jew being more, but it says Jewish citizens. So does that mean no Jewish citizens? And for example, like we have the two major sort of financiers backing the political campaigns of the Democrats and the Republicans are people like Chaim Saban for the Democrats and Sheldon Adelson for the Republicans. And both these people are out in the open saying that that's their only issue. That's their main issue. Sheldon Adelson publicly said that he would rather have served in the IDF rather than in the U.S. Military. So we're not allowed to sort of like say what powerful people have proclaimed openly. And then you also have then Jason Greenblatt basically saying, okay, yes, you're allowed to, have disagreements with George Soros, and I have certain disagreements, and I even have some with, you can even critique Adelson, and I actually sort of disagree with him. Can you imagine, where do you agree with Sheldon Adelson? That's my question.
That's a great question.
But yes, in terms of this question, and we only have 2 minutes left. I'm sorry I took us on that sidetrack because I think you're right that the main thing is we need to amplify the open discourse about real facts, real history, real analysis of power, and there really is this gaping hole or wound on the left in terms of the cover-up of these kinds of analyses that includes the kind of analyses that Alison Weir does, but then we also see this intense reaction to things like anti-Semitic 9/11 conspiracy theories or Christopher Bolin at the Brooklyn Commons, where these alleged progressive networks that are supposedly anti-war, basically, from their actions, it seems to me that it's worse to try to do an analysis of Jewish state power and the deaths that result from it. It's worse to do that, the analysis of it, than it is the actual originating crimes, such as the Iraq War and substantial parts of the War on Terror and 9/11 and all of these things. So yes, the real progressives, the real leftists, the real Jews, the real liberal Jews got to get their act together in relationship to conversation. Embrace that aspect of the best of both the American and the Jewish traditions. Let's get it out in the open. Let's have a conversation. And that is our solution.
Super quick before we go, that continuing to conceal any type of evidence and in facts and real information out there about who Donald Trump really appears to be, who really is, and who's really behind him and what is really behind him. That is also I think a major kink in the armor of trying to actually really understand how quote unquote Jewish power works in a way that is not hateful and is not going to actually cause any type of serious backlash against Jewish people. So I would also, think progressives should start to be perhaps more honest with themselves about that as well, and continuing and stop trying to act like this Russiagate thing is just a big nothing burger.
Great point. Let's return to that soon. Okay, until next week, Greg. Thank you so much. Antidote, we out.
All right, thank you.